Hello, good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the CISI and the Chartered Banker Institute, both members of the Chartered Body Alliance, welcome to our joint roundtable on responsible banking. I'm Simon Thompson, I'm Chief Executive of the Chartered Banker Institute and your chair for the next hour or so. I hope you've all had a chance to grab some food. Now it's time for, hopefully, some food for thought to go with it. Now, whether you follow Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg, David Attenborough, Mark Carney, Alok Sharma or Nicola Sturgeon, and I follow all of them on Tinder, which creates havoc with my dating profile, you can't have helped but notice the prominence given in politics, in policy, in regulation, in finance and civil society to tackling the climate emergency and managing a just transition to a more sustainable low-carbon world. Our financial services sector, as I'm sure we'll hear a lot about today, and in the months to come in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow, has a key role, perhaps as we might come to hear today, the key role to play in leading that transition from a high-carbon to a low-carbon world. The Paris Agreement on climate change requires its 197 signatories to make flows of finance consistent with lowering greenhouse gas emissions and climate-resilient development. And I think it's very telling that the key global climate change agreement has in one of its three main objectives singled out the key role that finance plays. When we talk about the role that finance plays, that's our key role because it's banks, investment funds, insurers and other financial institutions that by doing what we do best and what we're supposed to do can connect the private capital and savings with the investments and projects needed for that transition. And the good news is that the capital we need is there. It's held in all the high savings balances in Southeast Asia and other places. And the technologies we need are mostly there as well. We just need to find a way to connect the two. It sounds very simple. Perhaps we might get onto some of the reasons why it's not quite as straightforward and why we haven't solved it yet. Let's see. Also, as many of you may have seen, in January of this year, the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report ranked climate change as the key risk faced by business, finance and society over the next 10 years. Even more striking was that all of the top 5 risks identified by the business CEOs, the NGOs, the politicians and the academics they survey in the report, all of those top 5 risks identified were environment and climate related. Also last month, and it's been widely reported, Larry Fink, the BlackRock chief executive, wrote in his annual letter to clients that climate change presented a substantial systemic risk to firms and markets. BlackRock would therefore compel firms to disclose their climate-related risks in line with the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, and also would rebalance their own funds to reduce exposure to some high-carbon sectors, in particular thermal coal. The European Investment Bank, just before Christmas, announced they'd become the first multilateral development bank to stop financing fossil fuels and become, in their words, the first climate bank, hopefully by late 2021. And we heard last week that RBS will continue to reduce its lending to oil, gas and coal, and Rishi's from RBS and will, I'm sure, say a little bit more about that later too. I mean, there's a strong, compelling moral case for green and sustainable finance, but there is a equally strong, if not more compelling, economic and commercial case alongside that moral case, a positive case driven not just by the risk side of things, but also by the commercial opportunities to finance the transition, which is estimated at perhaps some $6 trillion of investment per year to invest in the climate adaptation and mitigation technologies. And we can already see the impact. So just look at the recent example of Tesla, for instance, and there may be many reasons why the share price has zoomed up to whatever it is today. But clearly part of that is it is seen as a firm that will play a key role to play in a low-carbon world that we need to move to. Now this green and sustainable finance in terms of responding to the climate emergency may be the part that hits the headlines, but there is a much wider aspect to sustainable finance or responsible banking and finance, to bring it to our theme today, which in our view as a professional body is equally, if not more, as important. And it's that wider perspective I hope that we as the panel and you as our audience will bring to our roundtable today, and I apologise for our roundtable being the wrong shape. That wider perspective is ensuring that banking and finance can support customers, communities and society as a whole through responsible, inclusive, patient, socially purposeful finance, including, but by no means limited to, tackling the climate emergency. It's a banking and finance that has at its heart the principle of stewardship, but taken beyond the sort of old-fashioned approach to stewardship, which was being a steward of depositors or clients' funds, and thinking about stewardship of people and stewardship of planet. But it's the same philosophical principle at heart. I think that incorporates, but isn't limited to, responsible lending, financial inclusion, serving all customers and communities to the best of our abilities and putting their needs and interests before our own. These are all aspects of a responsible, professional, socially purposeful approach to finance, aligned with the new United Nations Principles for Responsible Banking, which were launched at the UN General Assembly in New York last September, with some 130 banks from 49 countries representing around a third of global banking assets as founding signatories, including RBS, Barclays and Standard Chartered from the UK. And our own institute, the Chartered Banker Institute, was one of the first non-bank endorsers too. In brief, those 6 principles require banks to incorporate green and sustainable finance principles into their strategies, activities and operations, and link their business plans to societal objectives as expressed in particular by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement. They also require banks to identify their most significant impacts on the economies, the environments, the societies where they operate, develop measurable plans to increase the positive and reduce the negative impacts, and report publicly on the achievement of those plans. The principles are principles for organisations, for banks, and provide, in my view, a very helpful and I think inspiring in many ways framework for positive change in banking and finance for organisations. But for the principles to continue to drive and to support a culture of responsible, sustainable banking, I think alignment is needed at 3 levels, not just at the institutional level. We need to see policymakers, regulators and industry trade associations at the industry level leading a collective approach to endorsing and implementing the principles. We clearly need the institutions themselves to get behind it and more institutions beyond the founding signatories to get involved. But also at the individual level, we need professional bodies and educators such as CISI and ourselves bringing the principles to life for individuals, embedding them in our professional standards and qualifications, and setting out how the principles can be demonstrated by colleagues in day-to-day professional banking and investment practice. Because change is led, and this is one area I hope we'll get into, change is led ultimately by purposeful individuals leading their colleagues and organisations, whether they're chief executive officers or customer service officers. Everyone can be a positive agent for change wherever they work. Hopefully, Lydia, you'll perhaps pick up on that later because some of the work you do very much speaks to this. And the change we as a professional body and many others too seek in mainstreaming responsible banking and finance, and the principles of responsible banking in particular, needs to be led by increasing numbers of competent, capable, committed finance professionals, not just by green and sustainable finance professionals, but by all finance professionals. This needs to become part of all of our daily professional practice. So if, as I know they are, banks like Standard Chartered, Barclays and RBS and the other signatories to the principles are genuinely committed to aligning business strategies with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, to working responsibly with clients and customers, to embedding a culture of responsible banking, then actually relevant education and training for colleagues across organisations is key. And certainly we as Chartered Banker Institute are already seeing this begin to happen within the UK and to some extent internationally too. But there's still a lot more we could be doing to help all colleagues develop, demonstrate and maintain the professional values, knowledge, skills, attitudes and behaviours necessary to support strategic alignment with the principles and a culture of professional and responsible banking more broadly. Anyway, to explore and discuss some of some of these themes today and what we mean when we talk about responsible banking, responsible finance in general, aspects of the UN principles and green and sustainable finance in more detail, I'm delighted to welcome 3 expert panellists this afternoon. We have on my far left, we have Lydia Hascott, who's Head of Entrepreneurship at the Finance Innovation Lab. We have Hugh Whelan, who's the co-founder and managing director of Responsible Investor. And we have Rishi Madlani, who's the Sustainable Finance Lead at RBS. So I'd just like to ask, beginning with Lydia, each of my panellists to briefly introduce themselves for a minute or two, and to start off with, just say a bit about what does responsible banking and finance mean to them and to their organisation.
Great.
Lydia.
Thanks, Simon. Hello, everybody. Yes, I'm Lydia Hascott, Head of Entrepreneurship with an I at the Finance Innovation Lab. Finance Innovation Lab is a charity that is working for a financial system that serves people and planet. We do that through working with early stage financial innovators, with professionals within mainstream financial institutions, non-profits and regulators, and bringing them together to explore what a responsible, sustainable and fair financial system might look like. I lead our work with mainstream financial institutions, and we have a network of individuals working within banking and investment who are exploring ways that they personally can play a role in creating changes that influence their institution to benefit society and the environment in new and better ways. And we support them through peer learning, bringing them together to share what works, what doesn't in confidential pre-competitive environments. We develop them as leaders and train them and connect them with our multi-stakeholder community of people working for change across the financial system beyond what we often think of finance as those of us who are working in institutions. So I think to explore what do we mean when we think about responsible banking or responsible finance, it always starts for us as asking why. What is the purpose of banking and finance in society? What function does it exist to serve? And then bringing it back down from there. So the obvious responses that we often find to that question is it's things like safeguarding assets, maintaining transaction and settlement systems, sharing risk, managing liquidity, which are all immediate purposes of finance. But then the question comes up, well, why? What is the ultimate purpose of that? And a number of researchers and groups have suggested that it's to enable individuals and communities to meet our goals. So if that is the purpose of banking and finance in society, what does that mean that if we bring it down to the organisational level, what does a financial institution need to look like? How does an organisation have a clear understanding of how it's contributing to that broader sector-wide purpose and really organise itself to deliver on that? And then you bring that right back down to the team and the individual level. So what's the purpose of a finance team, of a risk team, of a P&L owner in delivering on that purpose, which comes up to the sector-wide purpose? And then what's my purpose as an individual? What are my values? What's the Venn diagram that intersects with what I'm passionate about and care about and the type of world I want for my children and the role that I'm in and the job that I do within banking? And if there's vertical alignment across all of those scales, that's where we might start to see a financial system that's genuinely delivering on things like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, etc. And we've seen a really interesting shift in the last year, well, longer, but particularly an acceleration in 2019, where this idea of the warm fuzzy stuff, traditionally warm fuzzy stuff of sustainability and responsibility, being seen as a niche strategy that sits alongside, often in a sustainability team that reports into marketing and communications, to it really being something that's embedded in core corporate strategy through regulatory shifts, through practical reasons in terms of customer engagement, talent attraction and retention, risk management, and the overall research that organisations like the Global Alliance for Banking on Values have found in terms of the benefits to long-term financial sustainability for operating in this way. Lots more to share on that, but that's a bit of an overarching frame of how we think about it.
That's great as an opener. I was going to turn to Hugh, but if you don't mind, Hugh, because the sort of one of the last points you made there around how sort of sustainability has moved kind of beyond being a niche and it's in the CSI and the marketing department to being part of the mainstream, that plays very much into Rishi's role and some of the announcements that RBS made last week. So perhaps I could ask you to go next and maybe just pick up on some of those themes that Lydia.
Brilliant, absolutely, and so thank you for inviting me today. And as Simon said, I'm Rishi Madlani, and I have the pleasure of leading climate and sustainable finance at RBS and soon to be NatWest Group. I've been at the bank nearly 15 years now, and I worked across a range of products from M&A out in Frankfurt to DCM, sadly before green bonds were even a thing, so it gives a bit of a sense of how long I've been doing this. I spent a large chunk of my career working in project finance, supporting UK renewables before I moved across to our sustainable banking team. And as of last year, we now sit within group strategy, and our head reports into the CEO. On Friday, if some of you may have seen some of the announcements, we announced our new strategy along with our annual report and accounts. And apologies if I do refer to notes today. It's so fresh that I have to just check myself that I'm making sure I'm using the right language. And it's been a bit of a 2-year journey. So I've been in sustainable banking for quite a period when we first started looking at purpose. And so it's been a bit of a conversation and an evolution. And obviously, when you've got a new CEO coming in, that gives you a very good opportunity to really land and help make change in an organisation, because it's one of those inflection points when you can really think about it. And on Friday, I was delighted to see our CEO in front of shareholders start looking at telling to look at us, not just on our pure financial reporting, but also on our purpose. And this is, I think, quite ahead of the curve in terms of, and a lot of banks and a lot of financial institutions are beginning to talk about purpose as part of this journey, but actually to see our CEO get up on Friday, and Lydia was one of the stakeholders there, and express what this begins to mean to us, because actually it's all very well having a sustainable banking team or having a few people in sustainability, and I see a couple of my colleagues here today. I need to be flexing that whole muscle of the organisation to really focus if we're going to challenge and tackle some of these purpose-driven themes. She also acknowledged very closely that we're not going to get this right straight away. We will misstep. Some of the themes, and I'll come on to some of our initial areas of focus, will be very difficult to get right. Climate change, for example, and no spoilers here, but climate change, obviously one of our initial areas of focus, is a difficult issue to grapple and will require collaboration. It will require, this is a team sport, not a competitive endeavour. And I think this kind of ties in quite nicely for me, some of the principles of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are about working in partnership with the goals. And actually you're going to have to see financial institutions collaborating on some of these pieces. I think acknowledging that we are living in an unprecedented period of disruption ahead of some of this, whether it's technology changing, the way work is changing, there are huge changes hitting us, and climate being one of the largest ones. We need to be thinking about being more agile as banks and financial institutions to be able to tackle some of those issues as they emerge. So I'll just outline our 3 areas of initial areas of focus amongst the strapline for our new purpose is to champion potential, helping people, families and businesses to thrive. Now, for me, that's quite an interesting evolution of the way you're looking at what our customer base is and looking at how reflecting more our role in society. The 3 areas of initial areas of focus that we've highlighted that we need to focus on, and that we, particularly with a UK focused bank with a certain footprint, is addressing the barriers to enterprise and business creation. So supporting SMEs. Skill building, which is where the partnership with Chartered Bank Institute comes in so importantly, and particularly around financial confidence. And there's some of my colleagues here who have led and bled and cried through some of this, getting us to our final point for announcement on Friday. And then climate change, which is my area, and supporting the necessary transition to a low carbon economy. And I'll be happy to take some questions on those as we open out the discussion.
Great. Well, great introduction, and I think you did that without notes, so we can report back to your CEO that the message has got across, and you got the new name right as well, which nobody else has so far, so well done. So Hugh, we're talking about responsible banking. It's all really quite sort of new in banking. The UN principles were launched last September. But in the sort of broader investment world, we've had the principles for responsible investment for more than a decade now. Your own publication, Responsible Investor, I guess, is similar age or whatever now?
I was just thinking we've been doing this for ages, so why has it taken banking so long?
Yeah, so why has it taken banking so long? And what lessons should we learn from the investment sector, do you feel?
Maybe I'll come back to that in a second, but just a very brief intro of myself. You can see my name on the screen, so I don't need to repeat that. But I'm a finance journalist by background. I've been a reporter for 25 years, most of which was in straightforward finance reporting, working for a number of different newspapers, the FT, Financial News here in London, where I was the asset management editor. I was part of the team that built up a magazine called IPE in the investment and pensions world. Writing for The Guardian and other newspapers broadly around finance. But one of the things that had frustrated me personally for a long time and the people that started Responsible Investor was that the classic economic externalities that are sort of left out of finance weren't being written about very much. And not only that, those sustainability issues were becoming much more important, dangerous, and undervalued. And as a finance reporter, and as a journalist, that to me is an area where the media should be doing a lot more coverage, particularly in the finance space, because a lot of these themes were not being looked at through a rigorous financial and business lens. We decided to launch Responsible Investor as a publication in 2006, 2007. Fabulous timing, just in the teeth of the financial crisis. So I guess the fact we're still in existence is testament to the ability to build a small independent media company and survive because of the importance that is being attached now to those sustainability themes as drivers of business reality and investment reality, both of which are, of course, interlinked. And Responsible Investor does that. We're a daily news service writing about sustainable finance, primarily for the last 13 years for institutional investors, the pension funds, foundations, sovereign wealth funds, their advisors and the asset managers that run that money. But also, actually, we've done quite a lot of work on sustainable banking since we started, without it necessarily being a recognized area. I guess in some ways, something like the Principles for Responsible Banking starts to put a label on that, and then you kind of coalesce around that. But of course, the areas like the Equator Principles have been around for longer than the Principles for Responsible Investment, and consideration of sustainability themes, the important sustainability themes, whether it goes from the environmental side, water, human rights, labour rights, land rights, all of these issues which come under serious business and investment risks to those people who are in the lending business, primarily in project finance and other areas. We've written about since they've been around, when we could. It's been a bit of a sideline to some extent, but we consider banking, of course, very much in the finance area, so we'll write about that. I think that's pretty much what it's always meant for us, and we're increasing our coverage of what's happening in the banking area, because I think actually that start in mostly project finance and lending operations is now moving much more into the retail area. Rishi made some really good points there about how banks, of course, are weighing up purpose, quite rightly so, I think. The Principles for Responsible Banking are of course, in many ways, a mirror of the beginnings of the Principles for Responsible Investment. So they'll have a lot of the hallmarks of what we've covered for the last 13 years around the institutional investment space. So I think it's a really interesting time to be reporting on this area, looking at this area, and looking at where areas like corporate business strategy, internal thinking, the reality of doing business in the modern world versus the sustainability challenges we face. We'll get more to that in a second, but it's a fascinating area of evolution and discussion, and it's an essential one. So, looking forward to your questions and looking forward to hearing more from the panelists as well.
Okay. And perhaps picking up on that, so Hugh, or for Lydia and Rishi, for you too, so that almost, you almost started talking there about how do we move from a kind of client-led approach in banking, in fact, where banks have been kind of responding to client requests on this sector, but then to purposeful banks, which are banks that are leading clients down the transition route as well. And that seemed to be, a key part of this. And we're only probably at the start of that journey. So I don't know, are there any lessons from the institutional investor side about how one moves from a client-led to leading client business? And Rishi, from a bank perspective, or Lydia from the Finance Innovation Lab perspective, any thoughts on how we address this?
I think if I was looking at, maybe just briefly on some of the realities of what have happened in the last 13 years around responsible investment. I mean, when we launched Responsible Investor, many people who I knew in the finance journalism area looked at me like I'd gone completely barking mad. Not only was it probably one of the biggest oxymorons out there, most people were like, are there any? Is it possible? But I think that there was generally a sense that, listen, this is a government issue here. these big sustainability themes are things that our politicians should be looking after. Business gets on with the job of business, that kind of Friedman style moniker, and why are you even doing this? But I mean, I think the reality is that governments and business and finance have to work together to resolve these issues. And that's a complicated sort of sphere to operate in and to think about, but it is what will, I mean, climate change being the classic example. We know in a sense where the problems lie. They lie in our reliance on fossil fuels and those huge businesses that meet that need. We also know that the solution is going to be probably a mix of regulation and business change and financial change, because they're also interlinked these days. So in the investment world, we've gone from, when the principles for responsible investment started, probably you could get 100 people in a room from the finance world max talking about this, to huge events, discussion, shifts in the changes in the way that those investors are starting to think about the financial reality of what they do, engagement from investors with companies on those issues, which has been a fairly new area and is still being felt through for what it actually means, and huge changes in the internal mechanisms by which asset managers and asset owners think about sustainable finance. That's the positive side. The negative side is that it's still very niche, and it's still really in the exploratory phase, I'd say. There's a lot of greenwashing out there. There's a lot of grand statements that are being made about what sustainability and sustainable finance is and isn't. But we have moved on a massive way without really much in the way of regulatory and government support. And I think we're at that stage now, actually, where governments and regulators are starting to look at this much more closely, and you see this in the EU. And I think the same arc, probably much more quickly, will happen in the banking space. And again, banking has a lot of experience, particularly on the lending side, in this area already. So, the principles for responsible banking are kind of, they're almost a moniker that's arrived to coalesce around, but this work has been ongoing for quite some time. We'll come back to some of the other stuff afterwards.
Build on that, Simon. I mean, I think banks have always been good at the negative side. So screening, we're good on risk. That's what we're meant to be, and we have risk departments and lots. When I was a deal doer and transaction doer, hand-to-hand combat with my risk officer was always what I had to do on every transaction. And we've always been good at screening out the most egregious, and that's through our environmental and social and ethical policies around how we screen out what we do. And that helps us remove some of the worst and most egregious negative externalities of what the impact of capitalism can be. But what we've not been good at, and this is where I think this journey towards purpose is about maximising our positive externalities. So whether that's in climate, helping decarbonisation and supporting economic growth, or our CEO Alison did this Rose review last year, which identified 250 billion of potential economic growth that could be unlocked by supporting female entrepreneurs. And these are the sort of gems that we should be providing that insight and enabling our customers to unlock, whether that's through learning, helping our customers increase their savings. There are positive externalities from some of these activities, and it's been a very risk-focused, and understandably a risk-focused proposition, but how could we get those brains in the bank, our 60,000 employees, thinking about what are those other positive contributions I can make to my customers and to the UK economy? And that's where we need to change that thinking. And I think we're at a tipping point right now. I think some of it's been driven by everyone's climate pin-up boy, Mark Carney, that's excellent work at the Bank of England, absolutely brilliant, has forced those conversations, and we were having some of those already, but really accelerating those. And I hope that I'm sure Andrew Bailey will build upon those. But actually, there's nothing to get banks thinking and working faster than your regulator breathing down your neck on stress testing.
I mean, regulation is a topic I'd like to pick up on in a moment, if we can. But yeah, I thought that answered by this idea of was trying to move into an era where we are leading clients on that decision rather than just being led by demand.
We don't have the answer. So when we've announced the stuff on Friday, and I getting the conversations around halving the impact of our financing footprint by 2030, we can't even measure every impact of our financing impact right now. So to get a risk-averse, highly regulated industry to accept that we need to be bold, especially on climate. When you think about climate, this is one of the examples, all of you, if you have children or if you haven't got children yet, will be asked questions about your children who are either on school strikes or rising above this. And so this is a societal issue. Our new employees want to be engaged on this. But we can't fix this ourselves. We absolutely need to work with others. So this will require us working with our customers. So we mustn't forget the customer, and it will be working with customers. But we have to work in collaboration with other parts of society to solve some of these really meaty issues.
Which is probably a great introduction, Lydia, for what's the role for kind of civil society and organisations like the Finance Innovation Lab in this more collaborative space? And particularly, have you seen this changing in a more positive way over the past kind of year or two? Are banks being a little sort of more open to collaborating between themselves and with yourselves, with other bodies? Because that will be a good indicator of how far along this journey we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. So the role of civil society, I think, is one role to play. I think something that's emerging from this conversation for me is that there are many, many drivers and levers that need to be pulled for this to happen. There's no single silver bullet. It's not going to be regulation. It's not going to be customer demand. It has to be all of these things happening at the same time. And one big thing I see civil society asking for is for it to happen at a speed and scale commensurate with climate science, if we're thinking about it around the climate challenge that we have. And so it's not enough to wait to see a cycle of proving the demand from the early adopters and see the adoption cycle come through. How do we see this happen quickly? And there's also the just transition element. So Rishi and I sit on the advisory group for banking on a just transition, and how do we ensure that this is happening in a way that is involving the right voices? So there's procedural justice element and there's a distributive justice element. So how do we have the right people involved in this conversation to make it happen fast enough and in the right ways in order to generate outcomes for people that will be sharing in this? So that's a key role that I see civil society playing, is bringing those voices to the table. Citizens' assemblies are really interesting for that, if we can link them into political process in an effective way. There was a second part to your question, role of civil society and are you seeing the collaboration beginning to happen in the way that sort of Rishi and others were talking about? And perhaps, would you mind, because again, we, as with all areas of finance, there's a lot of terminology involved. Would you perhaps let's explain what the just transition is? Oh, sure, yeah. That might be. Yeah, absolutely. So the just transition is some work that the Grantham Institute at LSE is doing a lot of work around when it comes to the transition to a low carbon economy. How do we consider the social and societal elements in that as well? Not just around carbon emissions, but around the impacts that a transition will have on people when it comes to jobs, when it comes to communities, when it comes to customers accessing goods and services. So how do we wrap that all into one is what we mean by the just transition. And are we seeing banks collaborating? I think it's a real mix. So one thing I'm always cautious of is thinking about banks or financial institutions referred to as monoliths, because there are lots of individuals within these organisations and some are more collaborative than others. So the really effective people that we see within these institutions are what I'd call boundary spanners, people who are really strong on building relationships across silos within their institution and outside their institution to bring the right people in at the right time to shift mindsets internally, because one of the key barriers that I see from the bankers that I'm speaking to is shifting the mindset of, say, your chief risk officer, when you're going in to do battle, are they willing to consider new ways of assessing risk when it comes to climate finance than they have with traditional forms of risk management? So how do you do that mindset shift? That's where I'm seeing a bit of collaboration amongst peers. So we run peer coaching circles last year in New York. We've been doing it with the Principles for Responsible Banking signatories who are focused on sustainability to come together and share what is so hard about your role, what are you finding challenging, and seeing this transition inside your bank, let alone the stuff that your bank is doing in the outside world. And it's mindsets, it's navigating internal channels, it's building a network of allies internally and externally, almost the soft skills, like the people stuff, that's actually the hard stuff. when it comes to the different people within a bank. Some of people who will get it, some people who would come to an event like this, and I'm sure you'd all have colleagues who wouldn't be seen in a room like this in a million years. So how do you work together as peers to support each other in what works and what doesn't, and bring in those external, perhaps civil society allies at the right time, if an external voice will be listened to more than yours will on a particular topic.
Can I just throw something in there? Lydia made a really interesting point. Those areas of regulation, client demand, tech, transparency, political will, I think they're all coming together now, incredibly. If you looked around, you can see them coalescing. And even cynics, I think, will, if they see those things starting to align, will say this is really a reality of what's happening in business now. We need to understand those drivers. We need to really be looking at why it is. For example, someone, you mentioned Tesla, I think. Why the hell is it that Tesla's share price can double in 2 months? I mean, there are reasons for these things, and they're not just about the brilliance of Elon Musk. These are bets that are being taken on the next 5 years of transportation. Well, you might disagree with them, but they are big bets being taken by the financial markets. The same way, why is Beyond Meat getting an IPO in the market for effectively plant-based meat products? Well, because 3 or 4 years ago, no one was talking about this. Suddenly, it's big business now, and not only is it big business for the private equity world or the private company world, it's big risk for those companies that are listed and may not be paying attention to these big themes that are starting to come through. Why are they coming through? They're coming through as a result of sustainability thinking. So you need to really be aware of what is happening if you're in business now. If you don't, and it's probably true that people in here already have an awareness, but I think that the game here really is in taking this information out to other people and saying, look what's happening at the EU level. The European Union now is introducing a Green New Deal. It's also introducing a Sustainable Finance Action Plan. It's introducing a taxonomy that all companies are going to be judged on, whether they are on the right or the wrong side of greening their businesses. If you don't know about this, you're going to be on the wrong side. And that is going to drive behavior globally. Are there going to be challenges within that? Absolutely. But that is a direction of travel which is very important. And when we come back to that, it's going to be the same for every company who operates in Europe. We'll see what happens in the UK, but whether you're a bank, a utility company, whether you're an investor, you are going to have to pay attention to what this means now. It's in policy and it's in client behavior, customer behavior. That's kind of like the accordion of what drives business value.
Do you think it really is the same for everyone? I was very struck last year when I sat on a panel and there was a senior banker from Nigeria on that panel, and he said, actually, look, for us, responsible, sustainable banking, it's not actually about climate. We know it's really important, but in Nigeria, far more important to us is making sure that the oil wealth that we have is more fairly distributed through society. Financial inclusion is a big issue for us. So, and he quite rightly challenged everyone on the panel to say, you're looking at this through a very European and/or Anglo-Saxon perspective.
I think most investors do that, actually. I think they look at those issues and they tend to contextualize them. I think maybe the big debates where we have them here are kind of climate-driven, but when you talk about sustainability writ large, lots of those investors that are weighing up deals are looking at economic development locally if they're sensible. If you invest alongside the IFC in transactions in Africa, they are looking at those issues. So I think it depends, and they're important issues.
So anyway, you've got a particular focus on climate itself, but more broadly across NatWest, I'll use the right terminology now. Yeah. Sort of what other areas would you bring under that?
Lydia's reference to just transition actually reminded us that climate is intrinsically a social issue as well, because in some ways, if the impact of climate change and global warming didn't have any other societal issues, then we wouldn't care. But because it has these huge risks from changing in adverse weather, from rising sea levels to mass migration, that's why it matters for governments, and that's why people have to think about this and actually think about who those impacts fall upon. And it's actually often, rising utility prices have a disproportionate impact on the poorest in society. It's thinking about what are these impacts and how does that work through the whole economy. And actually, it's different in each part, so depending on your organisation and what your footprint is. You really need to take a look back and see what are the material risks material issues coming on your horizon, tech might not be one for you. And you need to think, I mean, in financial services, it'd be slightly strange if tech was not one for you, but in different sectors, it'll be different, and I will want my frontline RMs to be talking to each of their customers around what are those material issues for them, and which are the ones we can help with. It's kind of why our purpose is not a climate purpose, because actually our footprint means that we have a huge impact on British business, we have a huge impact on the rise of female entrepreneurs, and on learning and educating our customers. So each organisation almost needs to take a step back, realise where's our locus of responsibility and opportunity, and then really focus on those. You can try and do everything, but that will mean you'll fail. So actually, it's probably right for the Nigerian bank to be thinking about it, but to be fair, because of the way climate is working across, the network for greening the financial system, of all our regulators, and a new regulator seems to join every month and coming up with something, or every week even, and it's almost impossible to keep up with climate news these days, other than reading The Responsible Investor. Plug in there, Hugh. $5 later, please. But you have to sort of stand still, and that will mean that there'll be different plans and different actions required by different sectors.
Yeah, and to generalise that a bit more, I think if you're looking for a way to influence your institution, mainly speaking to banks here, I'd be interested to hear if this applies with the PRI as well, but the principles for responsible banking are a really useful way to do that in terms of influencing senior decision makers to have a framework to hang this on. So if you're a signatory or if you want to sign up, there's a process that the principles require you to go through, which is looking at establishing every area of your business and the exposure you have in terms of the potential for positive impacts on people and planet and the economy, and the negative impacts, and then establish metrics by which you diagnose where are you at on that, an action plan to close the gap, and regular transparency and accountability to do that. And so if you're an HSBC or a Standard Chartered and your exposure is predominantly in Asian markets, you're going to be measuring something that's different to an RBS that's looking at small businesses based in the UK. So I think that's the frustrating part of this. There's not a nice silver bullet of accounting standards yet for this stuff in terms of how do you measure how well you're doing. And that's a really tricky one in terms of, I'm thinking about the greenwashing debate here. Yes, there is huge potential for greenwashing, and we are seeing it across the financial system. I think it's also important to acknowledge it's really, really hard to do the measurement and to do the transition. And I just want to acknowledge the people who are working in banks to try and do that work, while also challenging you all to make sure that you're seeing it as this is where we want to be, this is where we are today, we're doing our best to measure that gap, and here are the things that we're doing to close that gap. So RBS, it was encouraging on Friday to chat to a bunch of people internally who were saying that this is our purpose, we are not there yet. This is the beginning of the hard work in order to figure out where we are. Some things we're doing really well on, other things we actually have to fundamentally change our way of doing it. And as Alison said, we don't actually know. And that's a scary thing for the sector. The ability to sit with the unknown and build the ship while it's sailing, or rebuild the ship while it's sailing, is really, really difficult. And that also requires collaboration outside with players outside of the bank in order to create an enabling environment for that to happen, and also challenge institutions to not make it too easy through the greenwashing.
I guess the challenge is that regulators often don't like it when banks go to them and say, we don't really know, we're not really sure, we'll work towards that, we'll let you know when we get there. And obviously there's you mentioned earlier, I think, about sort of Mark Carney's role, and the Bank of England and PRA have been very, very thoughtful about sort of climate change, and there were some exploratory scenarios for last year, and there's going to be 2021 the first stress tests come in, and it has been best endeavours basis. It's going to sort of ratchet up a little bit more. But is there more that regulators could or should be doing to be understanding? I mean, perhaps actually, or if there was one regulation you would introduce or change, what would it be?
I think I'll go first. A couple of you thinking about in climate. Sorry, apologies if I could become a one-track-minded climate person, but it's what I've been thinking about non-stop for 9 months now, and I need to get out a bit more again. So I think some of the ones there's been a lot of debate about capital supporting factors. Regulators could hugely shift capital either negatively or positively if they thought about brown penalty factors or green supporting factors. Now, we're not quite there yet on the measurement piece, and I think that's why some of this, the stress testing is there. But actually there's lots of small levers. So one of the big challenges in the UK, for example, and again, sorry to be a bit parochial, is real estate, decarbonisation of real estate. So 80% of our existing real estate will exist in 2050, and we need to decarbonise quite a large chunk of that. Knocking down buildings and building new ones is not the carbon route to do that. So how do we incentivise that? Now, we've got lots of levers in terms of local taxation and all sorts of other forms. We need to change behaviours, and that does require a combination of regulatory behaviour and governmental behaviour. This wall of legislation that's come, and he eloquently put the sort of EU, what's on the EU horizon. And I do think there's a lack of awareness of how much that's going to impact everyone at the moment. And I've been in front of the European Commission a couple of times in the last couple of years, and their ambition is even further than what they've said so far. Climate is the starting point for them. Social is very much where they're going, and I don't get the sense that people realise that. And yes, we're a UK bank, but we will be impacted by everything that goes on in Brussels still, no doubt.
Maybe just a couple of things. If I had a regulatory choice, the first thing I'd do is get governments to remove subsidies for brown assets, effectively. Huge tax breaks given to the wrong kinds of energy production. First of all, that would be. I think you get into complicated areas when you start to look at supporting factors, and there are good arguments either way. But I think it's complicated.
I'm thinking the EU are looking at that quite seriously now, aren't they? I mean, again, we don't need to follow European regulation quite as much as we used to for some reason, but as I understand,
I think they are, because it's the obvious place to start. Really, you stop incentivizing things that you don't want to see over the long term, and then you start to plan for things that you do want to see over the long term. So I think most infrastructure thinking over 40, 50-year time horizons should have clear sustainability principles embedded in the way that they're thought about. This is going to be the big problem. It's disappointing to hear HS2 being talked about without any real kind of conviction on the sustainability front, whether you do it or not, whether you get into the economic arguments. That's just one project here, and then you can get into discussions about new runways and all sorts of other things. But we need to be starting to think about transportation decarbonisation now, and many of the impacts of sustainability are happening now, whether it's water stress in places around the world, whether it's the CO2 emissions that we're locking in now as a result of large-scale infrastructure projects globally. I think if you look at the stats on the Chinese belt and, well, my brain's gone Belt and Road, isn't it? Belt and Road. I was thinking Belt and Braces, but Belt and Road. If they build that without sustainability criteria, if the projects that are under the auspices of Belt and Road are built, the CO2 emissions would just blow us off course entirely. So we need to start embedding this thinking properly into economic growth in the right way, and that kind of thinking can be part of a just transition, which is really a sort of an attempt to get over the pushback from people who are going to say this destroys jobs. It doesn't destroy jobs if it's done correctly, and you're thinking about job creation, business creation, the knock-on effects of infrastructure are huge. We know that. If you look at the way that economic studies are put together on the benefits of infrastructure in places and their potential job creation impacts, we could be creating significant economic opportunity here. We already are, and we should be doing more of that. Remove subsidies in one place, incentivize in the right way that everyone can understand in other places. You don't need to get too technical about what that means, because people politically can understand that. That looks good to politicians. These days I kind of think let's get away from the stuff that's too techy and get into the stuff that people really want to, people want their kids to be growing up in streets that aren't polluted. Let's start there as real sustainability drivers. Good sustainable infrastructure and transportation would be fabulous. Let's move it on quickly.
So my one wishful thinking piece of regulation would be if we could remove quarterly returns as the reporting cycle. That would be
Everyone would love that.
Amazing, because short-termism is a key driver of this stuff. But pointing, I think, to some practical movements that we've started to see in regulation that, if they were strengthened, could be useful and could support that longer termism. One is the corporate governance code disclosures that are starting to require banks to demonstrate a strategy that's aligned with the purpose, values and culture, and explain how they're doing that. If that was to be strengthened and made much more rigorous, that could be really interesting, alongside Section 172 of the Companies Act, looking at expanding fiduciary duties to report on how you can demonstrate that your board and fiduciaries are considering impact on broader community and the environment. Because I think often the pushback that I hear around the place is, but fiduciary duties, we have to maximise financial returns. We can't do that even if we wanted to. So that leaves the only solution as being proving the business case and proving the financial returns, which is one way to do it. But there are situations perhaps where that might not be the best answer for people and or planet. And then the other one is looking at TCFD disclosures, making that mandatory, which I think might be coming in by 2022 off the back of the PRA stress testing. So continuing to see a risk lever being pulled would be useful as well.
I was laughing when someone was talking earlier, and I was thinking about how sometimes these things can change really rapidly. So, you know, it takes me back to discussions that were being had on the concept of stranded assets in the fossil fuel industry, the kind of subject that people in the finance world used to dismiss quite regally and loftily, not any more than 5 years ago. And now you have Kramer on MNBC, you know, and suddenly say, I'm out of fossil fuel companies, these things are dumps, you know, they're not making any more money. And you think, wow, you know, what a change in financial markets that you can be having these discussions and you can actually quite quickly start to see the economics change when you start to have discussions around really serious both financial and sustainability driven themes that are really starting to get momentum. You know, it's incredible.
Did you do other impressions, by the way?
No, that's a bad one. Someone had sent me over the clip earlier, so I was kind of, it's in my mind. But you know, there's amazing changes that you see now in the way that finance looks at these issues.
Definitely. Now we've got time for a few questions from the floor. I think there's, George, are you doing the honours with the microphone? Thank you. So if you just wait for George to come to you with the microphone if you have a question, please. Who would like to go first?
Hi, Ufuk Mush. I'm a compliance officer for a Dutch bank in UK. What should be the extent of the credit analysis done by a bank? I want to give an example. You know, Tesla is a company which is producing electric cars, which is against fossil-based fuels. But yesterday or today in the news, maybe you have seen that a German court blocked their new factory building because of the trees chopped. So the banks who were providing finance for good reason, should they also consider this impact?
Well, credit analysis, so Rishi.
A really good question, and it's never straightforward. There are multiple complex issues. Tesla, for example, and outside the bank, I'm a chair a small pension committee, a pension fund, and we're a large holder in Tesla. And we've had some real issues with Tesla as a social employer and around some of the behaviours in factories, and we've actually engaged with them on this through our local authority pension fund forum, because there are things to be considered, and that's where the sort of the ESG moniker really comes in, the environmental, social and governance. You do need to look at things in the whole. A company, just because it's a wind farm developer or a wind power company, does not make it purely clean and perfect. You do need to look at the whole ESG and the whole package and whether that sits within your risk parameters. But these are very important issues as well. I mean, you know, I think Hugh mentioned the equator principle. Some of these things have existed. There are some frameworks around large projects, but you mustn't forget the other issues. And I think there'll be more conversation about this. You know, I think climate is very much the issue at the fore of people's minds, from the Extinction Rebellion protesters to the school strikes. But I think this will broaden out, and it will broaden out very fast, and faster than people realise it will.
I mean, I think we went through a period in banking where we forgot that credit analysis is complex and difficult and multifaceted and so on. And I think it's quite helpful if this is one of the ways we bring it back to that, and it can't all be reduced to, you know, a few numbers into a spreadsheet and it produces lend or not lend. Yeah. There's a lot more to think about. Yeah. So Lydia, I'm thinking, because I think the lab, you did the kind of climate smart lending workshops and things, didn't you, in New York? So did this come up at all in that, or?
That was more focused around how do you influence change inside an organisation, yeah, less technical.
Okay, great. Thanks, well, great question. Is there another question in front?
Hi, my name's Keith Webb. I'm a business risk consultant working with banks. But I was wondering, who is taking the initiative nowadays? Are banks trying to innovate, or are they trying to support customer needs, or are people waiting for politicians and laws? Because I can't work out where the demand and the drive is coming from? Is everyone all going off in different directions, or might we actually meet somewhere happy in the middle?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, so back to what I started at the beginning, it has to be collaboration. If we want to tackle, there are huge social issues, whether it's financial knowledge and capability, whether, I think it's at the 22%, only 20% of UK adults have less than £100 in savings. These things don't get solved by a government policy. They get solved by a bank policy. It requires collaboration between institutions that have power in these situations. Climate's a very easy one. Climate, we have no idea of some of the solutions that will exist by 2030 if we are going to hope to meet already our current commitments. So you really need to be working together with your customers as well, because actually my cement manufacturer, manufacturing clients, or my mobility sector clients also have some of the solutions that perhaps work with my other sectors. And I need to be bringing that collaboration together. And that's the convening power of banks, whether that's regionally, and there's a lot about actually doing this in localities, because some of the just transition piece is actually bringing people together to actually what's the local solution. So in different areas, it will be different answers. But I do think the collaboration piece is the key, and it's something that there are lots of issues with populism and rising disparity in society, and maybe this is where institutions like ourselves have to step up and help bring some of that back together.
Yeah, I think in many ways the question is about how do you conceptualize what all this means. So in responsible investment in reality and the principles of responsible investment indicates this. It's a framework for enlarging the way that you think about the risks and opportunities of finance broadly, so investment decisions, and a lens that incorporates what is happening in the regulatory and consumer worlds and the sustainability risks as an influence on investment decisions. Let's call them investment decisions. In banking, call them finance decisions. You have to be clear about whose responsibility certain things are. It's up to governments, elected governments, to change policy and decide, and electorates to decide what's important to them in terms of their priorities for the way they want to see society evolve. I would argue that finance, I don't have to argue it, finance plays a big part in that decision making. And the question for finance is, what big part does it really want to play in future policy and driving future policy and consumer demand? It can play a positive part or it can play a negative part. And where it is on that positive negative spectrum is where we are in terms of the discussion we're having here in some ways. But responsible investment per se is just about looking at a risk opportunity analysis based on the world as it is right now. It's not necessarily thinking how do we change the world, but it should be really, because it obviously influences the way politicians put policy together and the way that we as electorates elect our governments.
I'll just perhaps rattle off a list of things that I'm seeing as some of the key drivers, and as has been said, it is complex. It's a system that we see change happen from many different places, but from the oh my goodness, we need to make money as an organisation perspective. There's campaigning groups and responding to pressure or avoiding bad publicity. There's regulation and policy drivers, which obviously comes from political mandates, which then influence regulators, which in theory comes from citizen choices and mandates given by them. There's the reputational thing around customer attraction, and then there's talent attraction and retention. So those are some of the key internal drivers, and if you're depending on whether you're talking to HR or a retail bank P&L holder, it'll be different, or risk manager. And then there's individuals in banks. What is it that's driving them? So I'm seeing change happen through individuals, positive mavericks agitating for change internally. They might be senior leaders affecting strategy. They might be somebody running a diversity and inclusion thing. It's different, but they all have individual drivers, things like legacy, often senior leaders thinking about legacy or thinking about the world we're leaving our children. The millennials around wanting to work for a purpose-driven company. How do we then attract people who have the digital capabilities for the type of bank we need to become? And then there's the moral arguments where fundamentally all of us are humans. We're not just bankers and finance professionals. So there might be standpoints on human rights, and this is fundamentally about human rights or environmental rights. Or there might be a utilitarian perspective of our role as banks and as individuals is to maximise the benefit to the most amount of people. So I think there's some of those internal drivers as well, and I'm really interested in how do you tap into those internal drivers, because I think that's where change can come from. I haven't met many finance professionals who don't want their industry to be contributing to the type of world that they want to live in or they want their children to grow up in. But somehow collectively, as a system, we're still producing results that not many of us want. So what is it that locks that in place, and how do we identify the leverage points where if we were to unlock some of those things, we could see greater change across the system?
I would hedge that a bit as well. I think we're in a period of huge tension between the reality of making money from the status quo and the reality of changing business and finance and society towards a different type of payout. I mean, I didn't see many banks holding back from working on the IPO at Saudi Aramco, because they were worried about the future of, so I think we also have to have a very clear, for those of us who are partisans for trying to enact sustainable change, we have to realise that this is a huge tension. Stock markets, Lydia made a brilliant point earlier about quarterly reporting, not because quarterly reporting itself, but partly because of what it represents. It represents a highly ratcheted capitalism that wants to see results now, does not want to invest over time, so there are huge philosophical and financial debates that are taking place there within the reality of what it is to make money these days, and it's a very hard thing to make money in business. It's a hugely competitive world, massive interest in the status quo, and very few people who can avoid making the decisions to be involved in that. This is an incredible time of real tension around these issues, I think.
I would point to banks like members of the Global Alliance for Banking on Values as really interesting examples of what it might look like to act differently. So Triodos Bank, for example, opting to charge a monthly fee for its bank accounts instead of overdraft charges, how it reports on what it invests in, how it chooses what it invests in. There are examples of what it could look like. I think it is that tension which is held in place by really tangible structural things and also mindsets. There's a new paradigm that we're being invited to step into, which is scary if you're the first one to do it. How can we, back to the collaboration point, step into that together?
If I may, give you a bit of a sort of reason for optimism then as we probably come to a close, is that, I mean, this is happening anyway. Our junior staff, we've got a new staff network, a Sustainable Futures Network, that is bringing WWF into the heart of Coots to speak on what does climate change mean for them, and they're picking up all these social and sustainable issues, and employees are rising. So when we reached out to our NatWest Markets colleagues in our associate analysis pool, we were looking for a couple of volunteers to help on the sustainable finance agenda. Out of the pool of 25, 30 people, 20 volunteered, because they want to work on this stuff. And if leaders don't get this in organisations, they'll be coming for them through the ranks anyway. So I'm very optimistic about what the future holds. These school strikers, the Extinction Rebellion protesters, are in our organisations and institutions, and they will be trickling through. And if you don't see this coming as leaders, you've got to be thinking about what's my role in this, and how do I enable people to add this purpose to their work.
Can I add one caveat?
Yeah.
To be contentious.
If it's an optimistic caveat.
It's not.
Oh, go on then. I want to leave people going away feeling good. So.
I'll try to land it in an optimistic way. I think one thing I notice, it's really encouraging to see and hear things like that happening. And one thing that continually comes up when I'm speaking to people trying to influence change internally is that there are people for whom the current status quo benefits quite well, and who have spent a long time working through the ranks to get to the point where they are, and it's helped them to create a great childhood for their kids. They've now got a mortgage that's dependent on it, all of these things because they care about family, perhaps positive motivators that mean that change is difficult as well. So there's a power thing internally. So how do we, one of the, I think, key opportunities is to break, and it sounds like what you're doing here, is to break the wall that we often see in seniority in organisations, so younger, early career finance professionals not having a say, but having important ideas, because nobody really knows how to do the sustainability thing well, at least let alone the senior leaders at the top. How do we break that glass wall and that culture of seniority deserves respect and decision-making power? If we can do that, then I think that's a huge step forward as well.
I think it was a reasonably optimistic way to leave it.
I tried.
And we do want to leave it with optimism, because we're all going back to work now. So let's go back to work and try and change the world this afternoon if we can, or if not today, tomorrow. I do want to be responsible and finish as close as we can to time, so we've run slightly over. I apologise for that. But please join me in thanking Lydia, Hugh and Rishi, our panellists. Thank you very much to George and colleagues from CISI for hosting us and for providing lunch. And also thanks to Anna and Rebecca, my colleagues from the Chartered Banker Institute, for all the organisation. Thanks for coming and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.